kind of go down the rabbit hole of chasing this data. But at some point, you don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. That at its core, this exercise and this whole movement in space the goal and intent is to drive towards action.
Let's do this. Hi everyone, welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk series brought to you by AKFI Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry consortium committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. My name is Isabella. I am the co-host here with Manuel, another co-host, also the executive director at the AKFI, and our special guest today, Mitch. Thanks for joining us today, Mitch.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hello,
Good
Mitch.
to see you. And thanks to this talk series, we get to connect with experts from the worldwide to together discuss the current state and the future state of ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. And about Mitch to our audience, quickly, Mitch is a seasoned sustainability professional with over 10 years of experience in helping companies manage risks and optimize results by leveraging software solutions to transition from Excel-based processes. He is currently the Senior Director, Sustainability at Sustain.life, where he applies his technical expertise and practical know-how to conceptualize software tools and features for the real world. Welcome again, Mitch, to this conversation with us. And to start our talking, we usually start with a broad question. To you, what are the current trends in using digital transformation and software to embed science into carbon footprint in tracking and reporting?
Yeah, great question. And I think one of the key concepts or cornerstones, especially when you're talking about carbon footprinting, GHG accounting, or working with organizations to identify where their emissions are within their scope 1, 2, 3, is really access to data. At its core, trying to figure out and calculate your emissions as an organization comes down to what level of, and most importantly, what level of primary data can you get, for example, from your suppliers, from other parts of your value chain, to be able to get to the real source and be able to start to build a decarbonization roadmap or plan to lower your emissions. Reason that is, and what software is doing to enable that is with, for example, all the APIs, tooling, and things that we have now to easily and quickly share data. It allows, for example, I'll pick on scope 3 emissions because I think that's a major topic for a lot of organizations right now. Diving into and being able to look at their value chain emissions. Really, it comes down to getting access to that primary data, or for example, what your suppliers are doing, and hopefully how you can either enable them or how they can start to decarbonize. And that is enabled through software in a number of different ways. We still have the call it maybe a bit of an old school way, but surveys, for example, that you can run a large series of surveys through your software through various different pieces of software to send it out to your suppliers to get access to that data. But more and more, and what I think is becoming very important, what can really enable companies to start to take action sooner throughout their sustainability journey, is things like publicly available data sets. We have, for example, CDP, I think, is a great one. There are many others that, with the reporting that organizations are doing, you have a data set to pull from that you can start to calculate your scope 3 emissions without having to reach out to, or without having to get each one of those suppliers on the line or responding to surveys, to be able to allocate your emissions and start to build a decarbonization roadmap. And I think at its core, that's really what software is doing in this space, is bringing us away from Excel, bringing us away from tooling that you're spending majority of your time just building the inventory, Instead, it's allowing you to start to take action. That sustainability professionals, rather than focusing on and continuing to, do that annual inventory and seeing how did we do, last year. I think it's a very timely topic right now, as most organizations are wrapping up their numbers and potentially putting up March and April, a pretty common time to do your ESG or sustainability report for the previous year. That rather than focusing on and just getting those numbers out every year, with software, with the access to more credible, reliable, consistent data, you can pull that data on an ongoing basis and start to track, monitor, measure, and make progress towards decarbonization, rather than just focusing on and getting the inventory out every year.
This, thank you, Mitch. But as you already pointed out, there is a lot of focus, or was a lot of focus, on reporting. We'll talk about the accuracy of reporting further down the line today. But you pointed out that the focus is shifting now from reporting to action, which really the reason to report and the reason to track and the reason to make this data public is to result in action, reducing the carbon footprint, the greenhouse gases. So any further, information or data you have about this trend? Is it a trend, or is the beginning of a trend? It's a trend, or it's a mature trend?
Yeah, great question. I would say it's a trend, and it's something that is becoming much more prevalent, and something that stakeholders are consistently expecting more and more from various organizations. And I think even looking back 4 or 5 years ago, at that time the big thing was everyone was really focused on, for example, materiality assessments, figuring out what is, and I would say not double materiality, which I know we'll get to a little later on in this talk, but just figuring out what is material to our organization, and what do we need to focus on and share with our internal external stakeholders. That really quickly, I think, shifted to, and as a part of those assessments, organizations have realized very quickly now, I need to be sharing my carbon emissions or GHG emissions with internal external stakeholders, whether that be because of regulatory reasons. CSRD in Europe is a good example. The looming SEC regulation that could be coming in the US is another great example, or because it's something that, whether it's consumers, whether it's my customers, are expecting that level of data because it can inform their decarbonization strategy. But now I would say it's shifted in where I think we're going with this movement is it's going to be much more on action. That yes, having the numbers and sharing the numbers is expected, and it's table stakes for most organizations, but sharing your decarbonization strategy, building a decarbonization strategy first before you can share it, is going to become that next hurdle or that next level for organizations. As part of that too, you think of things like setting science-based targets. You think of things like industry level decarbonization through industry groups and things like that. It's certainly becoming a lot more prevalent, certainly becoming a lot more common. And I think that's only going to assist in or make that movement go that much further. Because, for example, if a large organization, a Fortune 500, sets a science-based target, one of the things they can do is set a supplier engagement target where they would require involvement from a certain percent of their supply chain to either set a science-based target or be in a line to the 1.5 degree pathway, which by doing so, creates a really strong network effect that forces action onto those tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers as part of that process.
And you indicated a number of examples you may bring forward. Could you give us 1 or 2 examples of this trend actually taking shape? As you said, it's a movement now. It's not only a single company or a small group of companies. The whole industry may go and set targets for decarbonization and greenhouse gases, for instance.
Yeah, for sure. There's two good examples I can share. One is, I would say, in the pharmaceutical space or pharma, where quite a few of the big players in the space have set either science-based targets or are now requiring that their suppliers, first and foremost, calculate and report their GHG emissions. Uh, uh, Two of them I know for sure have said that you have to report to CDP if you are a supplier of um, these large pharma organizations, and that forces quite a bit of action and reporting on each one of the suppliers. And one of them has also required that each one of their suppliers sets a science-based target. And because of that, that is also a network effect depending on the size of those organizations. Some of them can follow what's called the SME pathway, which under science-based targets allows a company that's less than 250 employees under a certain size for revenue, certain number of requirements to basically be able to say that you need to focus on your scope 1 and 2 emissions and start to think about scope 3, but you're not required to set a target under scope 3. Whereas under the corporate standard, you have to set an emissions decarbonization pathway across scope 1, 2, and 3, which only makes that network effect that much larger. Where if you're a supplier of pharma, but you also supply or have suppliers of your own that are in other different industries, by having to set a science-based target, you're likely, depending on your size, going to have to engage in what your emissions profile looks like, going to have to engage with your own suppliers. And that might mean them setting science-based targets. It might mean them coming into alignment with a 1.5 degree pathway, which again, just pushes the necessity for data, B, transparency and reporting between various supply chains and stakeholders, and C, action. That a science-based target initiative, I think, is a great example of that movement. And again, seeing it in pharma, where you are seeing a lot of those network effects as you move down tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, but also requiring action through those targets.
Oh, very interesting. And if we talk about data, and was you made an intriguing statement before we came live, and that statement was that data is both science and art. And that indicates, when we talk about science-based data and so on, indicates a certain level of still, let's call it exploratory data, right? As opposed to hard data that you collect maybe using IoT, for instance, sensors.
Yeah,
So,
for sure. It's sorry, was there more to that
no,
question? Yeah,
no. So please, try to give us a little bit more context.
yeah, for sure. It's something, and I didn't come up with this. I've heard it a number of different times in the space, but yeah, the carbon accounting is both an art and a science. That there is GHG protocol. I think is one of the most widely adopted frameworks for how to do these inventories. There's also ISO 14064, which is another pretty common one. But under GHG protocol, there are varying levels of uh, call it rigor or different ways you can do these calculations, and they do prescribe um, when an ideal situation or I'll pick one example again. I think because we're talking about supply chain, I think this one's certainly applicable. That you have a lot of different options on how you do those calculations. You can, for example, use spend-based emissions accounting, or the spend-based method, where you're applying emission factors, and there's a few good ones out there. XEO base, US EPA EEIO is another one, where essentially you're saying that we spent X amount of dollars on this commodity, and it tells you an emission factor to apply, and here's our emissions. Now, that's it's a much more simple way to do those calculations, but the problem is you don't get the actual, you're not getting data directly from your suppliers. So if your suppliers start to decarbonize, if your suppliers start to take action, that's not going to be reflected in those numbers per se. The emission factors do get updated every so often. The chances that your individual supplier is going to affect the overall emission factor is probably not super likely. And really the only way you can start to reduce with those types of using the spend-based method is by spending less money, which is not a great decarbonization strategy. I'm sure executives would love to have a decarbonization strategy that's focused on getting discounts from suppliers, but I think that's not the not the true intent and purpose of how that's done. Where there's also allocation methods where you can get specific, for example, scope 1, 2 emissions from your suppliers, estimate upstream or potentially get upstream or scope 3 emissions from them as well, and then take a percentage of their revenue based on what you've spent with them to then be able to come up with an allocated number. With that approach, again, it's one step up the rung in terms of level of effort, but that gives you the ability to start to decarbonize, where you can work with, so you have your direct emissions from your supplier. If they were, for example, to put something in like a renewable program, or they were to focus on energy efficiency, something like that, that would be directly reflected in your emissions numbers. And you can really build a strategy around that. There are further levels up that rung as well, where you can do activity-based, or you can do things like even LCA data. LCA is another one that is sometimes a little bit more challenging for organizations to do, and there's software to help enable some of that. But the problem with LCA is that it's a very time-intensive process often, and you're usually not going to do it for each one of your products. Again, depending on what your specific product offering looks like and what you're doing as an organization. But if that's the case, you have to do an LCA every year, for example, or update the LCA at least every year to be able to do that, which can be a bit more challenging. And again, say this is where the art piece of it comes in, that the method that you choose to calculate your emissions really needs to be driven by or informed by your strategy. Because if your goal and objective is to start to decarbonize, and again, it's all based on the maturity of your program as well and what your level of ambition is. Because if you really want to start to decarbonize, you can't just go with the spend-based method. However, if you're looking for a baseline, if this is the year that you're just starting to build up your ESG or your sustainability muscle, and all that to say, I don't think spend-based is not a valuable exercise. It absolutely is. That knowing where the hotspots are potentially in your supply chain really allows you to build a strategy that you can focus on certain commodities that you're purchasing, work with various supplier groups potentially. But again, that back to the art and science question, it really comes down to the science and the approach that you take needs to be driven by or informed by your overall strategy. That if it is to decarbonize, you really want to focus on how you're doing the calculations and the data that you're using, because that will inform what you can do in step 2 and step 3.
So if I may summarize my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you said start by focusing in general, then measure where it counts, sort of a Pareto rule, like look at 80% of the emissions and use more precise, more accurate methods. And then the other 20% estimate, and that sort of bridges the science and the art, right? It's a Pareto art, if I may say it that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And yeah, that Pareto approach is perfect. And some of the exercises that we often do with organizations too, where you're really trying to figure out,
Sure.
And I would say this largely pops up in scope 3 for organizations that are building out their inventory using or doing a scope 3 emissions inventory, full scope 1, 2, and 3. You have a lot of flexibility, and again, you can become very granular and kind of go down the rabbit hole of chasing this data. But at some point, you don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. That at its core, this exercise and this whole movement in space is the goal and intent is to drive towards action, that we are working towards decarbonization. And in order to do that, it needs to be informed by the data that you have and knowing when to say, okay, this is good enough. Again, maybe spend-based, this is our baseline year. Spend-based is totally okay for us to start. If that's the case, then knowing and informing your strategy based on that and knowing when to draw the line is super important. so you can actually get to the decarbonization work. You don't want the exercise and all your time to be spent just on calculating and getting those numbers. It's totally about, okay, here's enough data for us to start to, and that's where I think software is great to enable that as well. That a lot of the tooling and things that are out there, again, using APIs, using standard calculation tools and methodologies can streamline so much of that to allow you to really get out of Excel, get out of the tooling to be able to actually focus out of the numbers, to actually focus on the decarbonization. And for example, engaging, working with suppliers, focusing on your own products, energy efficiency, renewable energy, things like that, rather than just spending your time to get the numbers together.